Thank you for that very warm introduction. I am really humbled and thrilled to be asked to give this lecture. I'm also intimidated because, like a good OR person, I planned ahead and gathered data. I came to last year's talk that Larry Wine gave, and it was incredible. Larry used fantastic graphics, wit, and charm to explain how he used sophisticated OR methods to save the world from nuclear terror. And that was just the first 5 minutes. He saved the world 5 more times before he clapped. Well, Larry is a very tough act to follow. So I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to present a travel log. Because throughout my career, I've done a lot of traveling, and I don't mean the kind of traveling that happens on planes. I mean the figurative kind of traveling to different disciplines and different domains. Because in Al Broomstein's words, I am a missionary. I was born here in the land of operations research, but I have spent considerable time traveling far afield into that heathen land of policymaking in Washington, D.C., and London, Canberra, Vienna, and Brussels. Now, as you would expect, as a member of a sophisticated culture such as our own, moving out into a technologically backward alien territory, I was able to help them solve important problems, and I will talk about that. But the learning went both ways. You know, like most travelers to exotic lands, I learned about their culture, but I also developed a deeper understanding of myself and of this land of OR that we all come from. And I learned some things about their habits and customs that might be useful for us. So I'm going to tell stories, because I'm a little bit Irish, and I'm going to, in the first half of the talk, tell stories about how our worldview and our methods, even very simple methods, proved so valuable in that land of policy analysis. But then in the second half of the talk, I'll share insights I had about how our traditional culture is not always well adapted to survival in that hostile world, and why we would want to adopt some of their rituals and practices. And then finally, in tribute to that late, great American philosopher and fellow MIT alum, Tom Magliozzi of Car Talk, in the third half of this talk, I'm going to describe an opportunity that I think our profession has, why our culture, perhaps broadened slightly by these insights from those exotic lands, provides the strongest possible foundation for leadership in the vast and uncharted world of policy analysis, and I would suggest possibly also in strategic decision-making in the private sector. So, as with all good stories, I will start at the beginning, and with drugs, the beginning is called initiation. Now, before I came on the scene, the social scientists who were studying this phenomenon thought that drug initiation, like all drug-related phenomenon, was just a symptom of root causes, that the real drivers were strain and anomie and racism. And so the tool that they brought to this problem, and really every problem they faced, was linear regression, in which the left-hand side variable was initiation, and on the right-hand side they would put poverty and unemployment and the divorce rate and so on. And I said, before we get theoretical, let's just look at the data for a minute. And for reasons I don't understand, I was the first one just to plot the number of Americans who initiated cocaine use for the first time year by year for all the years for which we have data. My undergraduate degree was in systems engineering, and when I see this, I see damped oscillation, endogenous feedback in a nonlinear system, and I know that unemployment and racism did not fly up and down like that. So I said, data is good, let me get some more. Let me try drawing this kind of picture for all 11 substances for which we have those data. But the brain scientists and the medical people said, stop, you can't do that. Some of those substances are stimulants and some of them are depressants. They're not alike. Some of them induce physical dependence and withdrawal symptoms, but not others. Some of them work on the serotonin systems and others trigger dopamine. You can't do that. You can't ignore 20 years of brain imaging studies and lump them together. But call me the fool, I did. This is just 11 time series scaled vertically so they fit on the same axis. And then I looked a little closer and said, why am I measuring time since Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem? What does his nativity have to do with what I'm trying to understand? So let me do one more thing. Let me just measure time in years since the drug became available. Heroin and marijuana came along in the 60s, powder cocaine in the 70s, crack in the 80s, and so on. So slide them horizontally to measure time as time since the drugs arrived. Now, I'm not a statistician with fancy statistical tests, but my eyeballs see a little bit of commonality across those 11 different substances, and that makes sense, because yes, they operate on different neuroreceptors, yes, they have different effects on your brain, but that's only after you've taken them. And we're talking about initiation. You know, initiation, that's new product adoption. We know how to do that. Mr. Bass taught it to us 50 years ago with the Bass model of word-of-mouth diffusion, and sure enough, it has nonlinearity in it. And when I parameterize that model, it's just 2 parameters, you know, it fits the first 25 years of that epidemic not so bad. And so there's the first of my stories about simple tools from our world being extraordinarily valuable in that world of policy analysis. Now, for the second story, I want to go further into what happens after it's no longer a new product. And here, I'm working with the insights of a brilliant Yale historian named David Musto, who gave a lecture at Harvard while I was a student at MIT. And because he had the long view of history, he knew that the country had seen ebbs and flows of cocaine and heroin use before in the late 19th century. He wrote a fabulous book, The American Disease, explaining his ideas about what was driving that. And all I did was translate that into a simple 2-state Markov model. Initiation is a flow into a stock we can call light use. People who have recently initiated who are mostly happy with their drug use. So they tell their friends and create that positive feedback loop. And most of them just quit from that state with no particular problems. But a subset of them, about 1 in 6, over time escalate in what we'll call heavy use, where they have a medically diagnosable disorder or brain disease. And most of them are suffering from it. And they become visible negative advertisements for the dangers of that drug, creating a negative feedback loop back on initiation. So simple system, 2 states, 2 feedback loops, a positive feedback loop that creates contagious spread and exponential growth, and then with a lag, a negative feedback loop that brings it back down. And so I parameterized this model, and shock and dismay rang through the land. They were bothered. Now, the exit rate from light use was fine, 20% per year, okay. But we estimated back in the early 1990s that the exit rate from heavy use was only 5% per year, and they said, no way. Maybe heroin could have a dwell time of 20 years in dependence, but not crack. We've never seen that. It couldn't happen. 25 years later, tragically, we know the model is right and the experts were wrong. Chronic stimulant use can also capture someone's life and destroy it for decades on end. Now, if we take this simple model and put it in phase space, so the horizontal axis is the number of light users, the vertical axis is the number of heavy users, you get these sweeping curves that the model projects that the epidemic will take through phase space, and the dots are the actual historical data. And so this simple model with just a few parameters captures that complicated nonlinear dynamic, which pleases us and is worthless for policymakers because they can't read that. So we translate that into a simple graph of demand over time broken down between light users and heavy users. And this graph was called by the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy the single most important graph created in the field. It was figured prominently in the national strategy year after year in the 1990s because it explained mysteries that had been plaguing them. Most particularly, how cocaine could have gone from the late 1970s light drug that yuppies had fun with to, by the late 80s, the drug that was destroying American cities. And the answer, in short, is because of the change in who was using over the natural course of the epidemic. If you can see on the graph in 1980, the vast majority of the demand was light blue from light users who had no particular problem. 10 years later, that had switched. Most of the demand was heavy users, many of whom were criminally involved. And we can update that model and project forward. And at the point where we were at the peak of this, people said, oh no, we can't stay with this so long. And we could say, don't worry. It'll come back down. And then 5 years later, when it did, they said, oh, great, we'll just extrapolate this down. In a few years, it'll be gone. And we could say, no, it's going to level out. And then in 2006, when cocaine use collapsed, a lot of people don't know this, but between 2006 and 2010, US cocaine use fell by a solid 50%. We could look at this model of demand and say, I know that that change did not happen because of changes in what was happening on the demand side. There must have been a cause on the supply side, a topic of active work. And we could build over the top of that descriptive Markov model dynamic optimal control that generated all sorts of insights, and I'll share just one. So here we are back in that phase space with a graph that shows how you would divide a fixed budget between prevention and treatment. In the lower right-hand corner, you put it all into prevention. In the upper left-hand corner, you put it all into treatment. This shocked and changed the policy debate, because until we put this graph out there, the debate was all between people who said supply, 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 control supply, and the intelligent people on the other side said demand, 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 just control demand. Nobody was differentiating between prevention and treatment. They thought they were both the same thing. There was no notion that they would have different roles to play at different points in the epidemic. But when you look at this picture, it makes sense. When you're in the lower right-hand side, there are lots of light users. That is, there are lots of people who are recruiting new initiates through that word of mouth, and there aren't that many people to treat anyhow. And when you're in the upper left, there are a lot of people who need the treatment, and there isn't much initiation anyhow because there aren't many light users to recruit people, and the drug has a horrible reputation. So the graph says that you very quickly alter the mix of these two interventions that previously people had assumed had to be done in lockstep. Now, it's enough on the demand side. I want to tell a story about the supply side. And if you're going to work on supply side analysis, you need price data. And unfortunately, before I got into this, the price data were almost useless. You could go to the law enforcement agencies and say, how much is a gram of cocaine? And they would say it's between $20 and $500, which is to say nothing. And so I sweet-talked the DEA out of their data set called STRIDE, which is transaction-level data on undercover purchases. And we started to try to analyze it, but there was a problem in the social science approach to it because you have to adjust for differences in purity. It's not all quality controlled, no Better Business Bureau. Some bags of cocaine are 80% pure, some are 8% pure, some are ripoffs with no cocaine at all. So the social scientists said, we'll create price per pure gram. We'll put the amount paid in the numerator. We'll put the pure quantity in the denominator. But when you divide by zero, it really messes up the regressions. But I knew what to do about this because my advisors at MIT said you're not allowed to model until you've gone and been in that system. So I rode along with the police. I made undercover buys. I interviewed the drug dealers, and I found out they're not that smart. The first dealer I watched arrested, the police read the Miranda rights and then said, "Sir, have you been arrested previously?" And the dealer said, "Oh man, I've been arrested a lot of times before, but I ain't never been arrested for previously." They're not rocket scientists, and they don't carry portable labs in their back pocket. They don't know the purity of the stuff in the bag. They're negotiating price based on what they expect the purity to be. And Al Drake taught me at MIT that the expected value of 1 over x is not the same as 1 over the expected value of x. And if I create price series that is the amount paid divided by the expected pure quantity, the price series all makes sense, and there's many things we can do with them. I'll mention just one, which is estimating the elasticity of demand, how responsive is consumption to changes in price. Crucial because the whole point of supply control is to drive up price. Now, the way you really do that is with econometrics, and I dabbled in that, but I mostly let the economists do it. But the problem I faced is how to communicate this to policymakers. Because if you say two-stage least squares, instrumental variable black box, they say go away. So these graphs, I'm sorry, no, I have one more story. I forgot. No, oh, this is the best story. So there was this 10-year argument between me and the economists about this idea that the people didn't know the actual purity. And the economists said, of course they do. They're rational consumers with perfect foresight and complete information. And we argued to no success until 10 years later, a wonderful data set fell into our hands from the French, who for reasons I don't understand, went to a bunch of heroin users and said, go buy heroin and bring it to us. Give us just a wee little bit we can send to the labs, we'll pay you for it, and tell us what you thought the purity really was. And so now I could create the graph. The horizontal axis is the actual laboratory purity. The vertical axis is what the users thought. The economist said that all the dots will line up on that 45-degree line, and this is where the dots really are. Now, the funniest part about this is I looked at that and said, I'm right, and they looked at that and said, we're right. Because that regression line does have a positive slope that's statistically significantly different than 0. But anyhow, so the applications, estimating elasticity of demand, how do I communicate this to the policymakers? And I said, look, do you think price influences the health consequences of drugs? And the most common answer was no, of course not. They're addicts. They'll do anything they need to get their fix. The slightly more intelligent answer was, well, maybe on the margin. In a multivariate regression where we include poverty and homelessness and strain anatomy, we could include it and it might explain 5 or 10%. But look, these are the raw data again. The dashed lines are the downward trend in prices for cocaine and heroin. The solid lines are the upward trends in the health consequences of cocaine and heroin. And I said, let me do this. Let me point by point take the points on the dotted line, raise them to an exponent called the elasticity of demand scale for the change in units, and see how much of that trend and how much of the wiggles in the solid lines we can explain with prices. And people said, you're crazy, it won't do much. But I don't know. When I look at that, it seems to me that prices raised to an exponent mirror, predict with dramatic success all of that variation in the health consequences. Prices matter, and they matter enormously, and not just for cocaine and heroin. Here's basically the same graph for cannabis. Now, I actually am not that impressed with those last graphs, because they were plotting things over multiple years. Lots of third variables can drive things over multiple years. So let me tell you a story that is more persuasive about prices. It comes from disequilibrium modeling of the second greatest success in drug control, the first being the decline in the US cocaine market. Back in 2001, the Australian heroin market collapsed. There's two lines here, one for known overdoses on heroin, the other is suspected. They both tell the same story, 80% decline in January of 2001. That is, they're telling you a story of hundreds and hundreds of people, by now thousands, who are not dead because of whatever happened in January of 2001. And so it's important to understand what made that happen. Now, I could look at that and say, of course it was a supply-side shock because demand from addicted heroin addicts doesn't drop that fast. But there is a cultural war going on in Australia between the treatment folks and the law enforcement folks, and the policy research community and the policy-making community lined up on the demand side, and they knew that anything that the police did was evil. They would not accept that this could have been from the supply side. So I said, look at price, and they did, and they said, see nothing. But this was just one data point per year with no adjustment for purity. And I said, can't you find purity data? And the answer is, yes, you can. It turns out the Australian state of Victoria is absolutely anal about analyzing every single bag they come into contact with, and then ignoring completely all of that data. So there are these brilliant analytical chemists with PhDs who work so hard to create the data and feel neglected. So if you show up and sweet-talk them and say, I am so impressed with what you have done, your data hold the secret to understanding the most important mystery in your country's drug world. They share this wonderful data with you, thousands of data points per year. Even the little wiggles are significant, and they all tell a story. But for today, the key point is just purity collapsed in January of 2001. So the purity-adjusted price series in blue doesn't look anything like the price series they had. And if I play the same game and take point by point each of those prices and raise it to an elasticity and then adjust for the units conversion, I can explain tremendously the change in death in Australia. I can play similar games with data from the United Kingdom. This is my favorite story. So I was working with a serious and organized crime unit in the Home Office in the United Kingdom, and one of the leaders there, he was a tough guy. I mean, he knew academics were stupid, worthless wastes of time. And when I'm briefing my PowerPoint pack, he's sitting in the back of the conference room, leaning back in his chair with his hands behind his head, doing everything he can with his body language to tell me that he thought I was worthless. And I put this slide up, and he shot bolt upright and said, I knew it! I knew it! I knew the Trident operation made a difference. And he was referring to that dip in 2000, when he was leading a program that was canceled because he had no way to demonstrate that it had an effect, even though his own people had the data, but he didn't think to look at them. And I love the dip at the end because it happens at the same time of the contraction of the US cocaine market, which helps us understand that that was probably because of something that happened in South America, not Mexico, because Mexico's not on the pathway that takes cocaine to the UK. This is the same sort of information for amphetamines. Clearly a substantial disruption. They didn't even know about it. And another lovely story is in the heroin data. So Afghanistan is the source of almost all the heroin in the world, certainly in the Eastern Hemisphere. When the Taliban were in control in the 1990s, poppy production soared, and then in 2001, they eradicated it all. And there's a story behind that we don't need to go into. But of course, the expectation was this would rattle the markets in Europe, and they didn't see a lot. And we now know the reason is because the Taliban were sitting on a full year's worth of supply before they shut down production for a year. But they started to see a bit later, maybe in 2003, but it was hard to tell because they only had one data point per year. And they said, well, maybe it just takes a long time to get from Afghanistan to the UK. But once you have this high frequency data, you see something else, and that is not much happening in 2001, but an abrupt drop in March of 2003. What happened in March of 2003? There was a war in Iraq astride the supply lane. Now, I'm not telling you that declaring war is a cost-effective way of reducing the heroin problem in the United Kingdom, but it does help to understand these things. And we have done an enormous number of these cost-effectiveness studies. I don't have time, I'm running behind to go through these, but they generate the most lovely sorts of recommendations. Like the top one you can get, prevention is cost-effective even though it's not effective, because it's cheap. But the third one, only a quarter of a prevention program's impact on cocaine use comes from preventing participants from initiating cocaine use. That's true. And there's a whole story behind it I'd love to share with you. And another one, much of the uncertainty about the cost effectiveness is not due to uncertainty about cost or uncertainty about prevention's evaluated effectiveness. That's true. And there's insight behind that. So we did all sorts of things like that. We modeled the supply chain. People used to think there were only retailers, wholesalers, and kingpins who brought it across the borders. You go talk to 170 high-level traffickers in the UK, and you can build a 5-layer network, and you can understand prices across different market levels following a very clear power law, which you can sort of derive from network theory, but this helps you to access the price information across market levels and understand their operations, and on and on. And really briefly, what I've been spending much of the last 3 years doing is writing business plans for the marijuana business. This is not because I want to supplement my professor's salary, don't worry, Dean Krishnan. But in order to understand how legalizing marijuana is going to transform supply, price, and availability, you have to be able to understand what the cost structure is back under prohibition, with quasi-legalization under medical schemes, and at different operating scales and economies. And the basic story in this graph is, as you legalize and allow honest-to-goodness professional farmers to grow it, the production costs will become sort of like the production costs of the water in this bottle of water, which is to say they won't matter. What will determine the retail price is going to be the marketing and the branding strategies. But I have to stop myself. I can talk like this forever, but I want to get to the second half of this presentation about things that I learned from that heathen land of policy analysis that are relevant to us. And I want to apply the Hillier and Lieberman test to myself. This is the table of contents from that classic textbook, one chapter for every method we view as core. And I can ask myself, and you can ask yourself, how many of these methods have you routinely used to generate real value in your professional work? And this is my grade. Green means used it all the time. Pink used it not so much. Now, I don't want you to squint and see if your favorite method got scored green or pink. That's not the point. The point is that if I'm honest with myself, I have a lot of pink. And you might say, well, that's fine to be a specialist in one method, and that's true for an algorithmist, but it's not true for an applications person. You can't go through life with a hammer, pretending that every problem is a nail. And you might say, well, the selection committee for this lecture blew it. Caulkins is a fraud. He's not a real OR person. And maybe, because although I grew up here and I could not have done what I've done, I have embraced multidisciplinarity. But I think the real story is exactly that the right way to address these complicated societal problems is with a multidisciplinary approach and to have it rooted in our profession. Now, before I elaborate on that, I want to tell 3 more stories, and these are stories about projects I did not do. Okay? Now, I told you Afghanistan was the source of all the poppy. During the Bush administration, we compelled Afghanistan to eradicate the poppy on the premise that because the Taliban was deriving its revenues from the heroin trade, eradicate poppy, cut the resource base. When the administration came into power, I was on the team advising Ambassador Holbrooke, who was the U.S. architect of our strategy for the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. I had the chance to pull out those Hillier and Lieberman methods and optimize, maximize the number of hectares eradicated per million taxpayer dollars, and I did not do that. And in fact, you can even see that at the end of the Bush administration, the cultivation started to go back up, and I think that's fine. Because the reality is that other strategy was shooting ourselves in the foot twice over. Afghanistan is a monopoly provider facing extremely inelastic demand. They love nothing more than having supply constrained because price went up more than proportionally, and eradicating the poppy was increasing the revenue. And worse than that, only 2/3 of the country was under government control. 1/3 was under the control of the warlords. Guess which part of the country the poppies were eradicated from? Our eradication efforts effectively moved the entire industry and all of its profits to the part of the country that was controlled by the warlords who were cooperating with the Taliban. So I did not do the study to improve the effectiveness, the efficiency with which we were eradicating hectares, because the strategic choice was being made wrong, and instead I wrote for Foreign Policy magazine and directly advised the ambassador to change the strategy. And likewise, I've had lots of opportunities to work with local police, maximizing the number of drug dealers that they catch, but I haven't done that. The problem with U.S. drug supply control is not that we can't catch enough dealers. We catch so many we don't know what to do with them. Between 1980 and 2000, the number in prison increased by 10-fold, and prices still went down. So my colleagues and I write papers that say it's okay to let the number of people in prison fall by 50%. Change who you're putting in prison. And in the era of marijuana legalization, so Colorado and Washington, first jurisdictions in the world to legalize large-scale for-profit commercial production of marijuana. That generated all kinds of regulatory questions, and we worked to advise the Washington Liquor Control Board on all kinds of questions like how many stores should they license in each county. In this case, I did do that. It was fun. It was a nonlinear mixed integer programming problem with cool properties that you could exploit. But I didn't do that because I thought that was important. I did that because I have 3 teenagers, and they're going to college, and the consultant fees were crazy good. I am much happier this year working for the state of Vermont. Their legislature commissioned us to do the analysis before the strategic decisions are made. Washington and Colorado jumped from complete prohibition to allowing the for-profit industry to promote the sale of this dependence-inducing intoxicant, sort of like big tobacco. There are all kinds of other architectures, all kinds of other strategic choices. I think that's the more important story. So now let me go back to these lessons that I think I've learned out there in the heathen land. And they're all just matters of emphasis. But I do worry sometimes that in our discipline of operations research, we jump too quickly to maximizing the efficiency of operations and miss the strategy. If you're aiming at the wrong target, increasing the rate of fire is not the solution. You need to change the aim. And I worry about an overemphasis on optimization when in policy analysis we usually do not have an objective function. A lot of policy emerges from a negotiation amongst many stakeholders. You know, the United States negotiates with Karzai or with Colombia. There's no single decision maker. And even if there's a single decision maker, usually the model only covers a portion of the system. And the executive is thinking about things that you can't put into the model. You don't optimize a component and think that it will optimize the overall system. And likewise, big data. I love big data. I'm all in favor, but I worry we forget the value of small data. In my experience, the big wins come not from the person who has the most observations, but the person who has any data at all on what really matters. And sometimes you learn more going from 0 data points, or 1, meaning an anecdote, to 100 data points, even if it takes months of work to get each of those data points, than you do going from 100 million to 1 billion. So I think there are ways in which our culture bred on the factory floor doesn't immediately translate fully over into that other world, which brings me to the third part of the talk. And that is, I want to talk about the opportunity that I think that our profession has. Now, if I step back and ask, what does it take to successfully analyze and solve these big societal problems? My answer is, it takes a team. There is no way a single person can do all of this. And it must be a multidisciplinary team. And absolutely, that team should include a classic OR person alongside the statistician and the economist and the public health person. That's not controversial to me. To me, the interesting question is who leads that team? Which is to say, what sort of training or background offers the best preparation for a young student today who wants to become the one who sees the big picture and integrates the talents of the diverse team members into an overall systems analysis? And I will tell you today, our profession's market share in leaders of these teams that are informing strategic policy decisions is not large. It's much more likely to be an economist, even a lawyer, God forbid. It's not us, and that should change. Now, if I were going to design the ideal curriculum to prepare someone for this sort of leadership, it would look something like this. I would put OR methods front and center. Hillier and Lieberman, absolutely, plus modeling, open-ended problem structuring. And their statistics, big data statistics, and experimental design and causal inference. There's a focus on decisions. Keeney and Rafa kind of decision analysis, yes, but also behavioral decision theory and economics and political science, even ethnographic studies of how executives really make decisions under pressure. A commitment to domain knowledge. Gene Woolsey, Colorado School of Mines sort of require people to get out and get their hands dirty. And a scientist's curiosity to discover through observation and description, rather than taking that new thing and trying to abstract it into one of the paradigms that are already familiar to us. Maybe even a tinkerer's penchant for invention. Sometimes there's too much of evaluating what's been done and striving for best practices, when what we need is a better than best current practice. At any rate, this is what I would prescribe. Now, I would submit to you that no discipline on the face of this planet covers all of those bases. But I would also submit to you that no other discipline on the face of this planet covers as many of them as well as we do. We get an A+ right up there at the top, and we get substantial partial credit in the other 4 boxes. They aren't our focus, but we know how to do them. We could do them. But I don't think the moral here is one of complacency and self-satisfaction. Rather, I think the moral is that we have an opportunity to tweak our programs a little bit, to broaden our self-understanding of what makes us great and what we have to offer the world. And I'd like to see at least some of our programs tell prospective students we have 2 different tracks. Track 1 is to focus on that Hillier and Lieberman corpus and become the sort of OR expert who can be a productive member of those interdisciplinary teams. But I'd also like to see track 2. Track 2 to prepare the people who are going to be the leaders of those multidisciplinary teams who not only work in the back office but sit with the executive when the decision is made. I want us to train not only fast sprinters but decathletes. So in summary, I think I've learned 3 things in my journeys through that strange land of policy analysis. The first is that our tools rock. We have tools that can make our graduates highly valued members of these teams. But the second thing I've learned is that too often they are only members and not leaders of those teams. Third insight is that if I were going to design from scratch the ideal training for these systems thinkers who can lead and coordinate the work of diverse teams and deliver the analysis to the C-suite, whether that's the corporate offices of a Fortune 500 firm or 1400 Pennsylvania Avenue, I think that ideal curriculum is only half a step from what we do now. So I believe that our discipline has a golden opportunity, maybe a duty, a moral obligation to embrace the challenge of training the next generation of these analytical leaders who can help our society deal more effectively with its greatest challenges. Thank you.